Today we're looking at F for food rewards. Almost all of my training is reward based, and food is one of the easiest things to use as a reward. But something that I hear very frequently is either I can't use food at all, or I've tried using food and it didn't work very well. So let's have a look into the reasons why that might be the case. By far the most common reason that food isn't working is that your food isn't good enough. Your food reward is not high enough value. And that might seem obvious, but I quite often have people bring in things like dry biscuits to sessions, bring in kibble or bonios or things like that, and say, no, but he loves these. And your dog might really enjoy that bonio, or he might really enjoy his kibble at dinner time. But as soon as the environment gets more distracting, or as soon as the work gets more difficult, that dry food isn't going to cut it anymore. So at that point, what's higher value is something meaty. So I use chicken a lot, I use sausages, I use patty, anything interesting, anything strong smelling, or I'll use something like cheese. So I use squeezy cheese quite a lot, cube cheese, whatever you want to use. Personally, I hate cheese, but the dogs love it. And you might also find that your dog works for chicken quite happily for 10-15 minutes. And then as they get tired and the work gets harder, we need to switch to something more interesting. So we whip out the sausages for another 10 or 15 minutes. And then further down the line, that's not working either. So we whip out the cheese. And we're trying to keep that food interesting enough and valuable enough that it outweighs other distractions round about us. And that brings us to the second reason that your treats might not be working. And that is that the environment is too distracting, or what you're asking for is too difficult. So your dog might be quite happily performing beautiful recall in the garden, but as soon as you take him to the park and there's other dogs and there's birds and there's people playing football and so many distractions, then suddenly he's not interested in those same treats anymore. Equally, my dog might perform a behaviour like a sit a couple of times. He'll do that quite happily for his food reward. If I ask him for something more complicated, he suddenly stops responding. The food hasn't changed, but the difficulty of what I'm asking for did. And now that same treat isn't good enough. So I either need to improve the quality of the treats, or I need to break down what I'm asking into more manageable steps so that he can understand. And it's often quite a good indicator of how your dog is feeling. If he can take that bit of chicken when you're at home or when you're on a quiet walk, but suddenly when there's a distraction around he can't take the chicken, it's quite a good sign that he's feeling overwhelmed. So far, this has all been pretty sensible. But another reason that your food rewards might not be working is that the food itself has become poisoned. And I don't mean that literally, I don't mean that there's anything wrong with your food. What I mean is that your dog is not seeing the food as a reward in that situation. So let's say your dog's afraid of the car, and you go, oh, okay, I'm going to feed him in the car every day. And that is actually advice that I give out quite a lot. You know, if your dog's uncomfortable being in the car, take them out to the car, feed them their breakfast there, don't go anywhere. But if the only way that your dog can access that food is to go into a scary place, the food's no longer a reward. Just because it's food doesn't mean that it's immediately rewarding. And it's the same if you're using food to lure your dog into a space they're not comfortable with, or, you know, if your dog's afraid of a human and the human tries to give them a biscuit, if the only way to access the food is to be uncomfortable and do a scary thing, the food might not be rewarding, the food might be coercive. And I do still use food in a lot of these situations. So I got a new car in January. Oliver does not travel very well. So for the first week or so, I did feed him his breakfast in the car. But if he hadn't wanted to get in, he would have gotten his breakfast outside the car instead. You know, if he'd stopped halfway down the driveway, we'd have stopped there. So letting him dictate what he was comfortable with and then rewarding him for making that decision was how I built his confidence. Not by putting his food in the car and saying, right, the only way to get your breakfast is to climb in. So what I'm saying is, don't assume that your food reward is rewarding just because it is edible. And if you're not sure where that difference lies, it's worth getting in touch and having a chat about it. And of course, there are situations where your dog is just not that into food. It's not accurate to say that he's not food motivated at all, because all living things are motivated by food. If your dog wasn't food motivated in the slightest, he wouldn't eat and he would die. But your dog might not see food as particularly rewarding. And for some dogs, it might be that they prefer to play, they might prefer toy-based rewards, or they might prefer physical affection. So giving them a cuddle and telling them they're a good boy might be more than enough. So sometimes it is down to the individual dog, but a lot of the time when someone tells me I can't use food because, when we actually analyse it, it's one of these reasons above.